TV. And I remember I had to get up to change the channel. Kids these days have no idea how good they have it. And I remember that my favorite two shows when I was little were Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Did any of you get to watch those shows? Or maybe your children or grandchildren did, and you just pretended you weren't watching, but you were just as engaged. Because there's something very comforting about both of those shows. And while Sesame Street is still around, my children sadly never got to experience Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood until last week when I found it like on Netflix or something. Because Mr. Rogers had passed years before they were born. And I wish they had gone to see him when they were younger. And there seems to be a lot of nostalgia nowadays going on around Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Probably because of the movie that's due out in November. And I have to warn you now, if you go to see it, bring a box of Kleenex because I watched the trailer and the tears were flowing. And with all the nostalgia, I've been seeing the old rumors resurfacing about how Fred Rogers was a Navy SEAL and how he was a hero sniper who killed hundreds of bad guys. Hate to break it to y'all, he never served in the military. But I do think he was a different kind of hero because he helped thousands and thousands of us learn how to deal with our feelings and to see each other and to see ourselves the way God sees us. And I think this stems because what you might not know about him is that after he graduated with a degree in music, he went on to graduate from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and is ordained as a Presbyterian minister. And so this was all part of his calling. He considered it a pastoral duty to return all of the fan mail that he received. He wrote letters back to everyone. And so, with my heart softened as I think about him, I made an impulse purchase and bought the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood game. And I've played it a few times now, and it's a little complicated. But one thing I noticed is that on the cards that have the characters, everyone from Queen Sarah Saturday to Bob the dog to Mr. McFeely the mailman to Mr. Rogers himself have equal value as you strive to create your neighborhood. And that makes sense, because that's who Mr. Rogers was. It was important for him to help us to see everybody as being equal. As humble and gentle and mild-mannered as he was pretty revolutionary, a little radical, and bold, if you watched his show. He would do things that weren't what people were expecting. Like during the Civil Rights Movement, he created a character named Officer Clemens, who was an African-American police officer. And one warm day, Mr. Rogers invited Officer Clemens to come sit down next to him, take off his shoes and socks, and cool off his feet in the kiddie pool with him. Now this shouldn't seem like that big of a deal, but these were the days when integration was just beginning to happen. When a large part of the country was figuring out what it would look like when people of color and people who were white could swim in the same pools. They hadn't seen that before. This was groundbreaking. And he did it in other ways on his show too. Other subtle ways where he would invite characters who weren't seen on the rest of U.S. television. He had a woman who was a doctor as a character. And there was a Latino family. And he had a guest who was a paraplegic a decade before the American Disabilities Act. Mr. Rogers talked about things like death and divorce that parents didn't want to talk to their children about. And you knew from his show that in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, everyone was welcome. Everyone was equal. And everyone was special. But I don't think everyone feels that way. Just recently, I read an article where someone took the time to write about how Mr. Rogers is a liar. That not everyone is special. And I rolled my eyes. But the truth is, a lot of us deep down might feel that way. A lot of us, if we're honest, might wonder if everyone is really welcome in the neighborhood. And some of us might question if we are even welcome in the neighborhood. And here at church and in other worship places, the question might come up about who is welcome at the table. Because are any of us even good enough? That was how the Pharisees thought. Those Pharisees that had Jesus over for dinner that night. They believed that only the righteous should be included. We find in the gospel today Jesus giving some examples of why that sort of thinking is troublesome. And to help understand, we have to remember that back in Jesus' day, there were no channels on TV to change. But it was an honor-shame culture. It was especially important to have honor. It was extremely humiliating to be shamed. Everyone wanted the place of honor at the table because that meant they were deserving. They were important. They were special. And so the people who Jesus was talking to probably didn't feel like all of this sat so well with them. As he's talking about not thinking so highly of oneself. Because they probably thought pretty highly of themselves. In this passage from Luke, we hear Jesus warning us that when we start believing that when we are more righteous, we are more important, we are more special than anyone else, we are setting ourselves up for humiliation. And yet at the same time, if we do not believe we have enough value, we're wrong then too. Because Jesus invites us to the table to see that we are essential in God's kingdom, in God's neighborhood. In Luke's gospel, we hear that all of us are vital. All of us are necessary. And whether we identify more with Prince Tuesday or with Henrietta Pussycat, God has been intentional in gathering us together, in giving us gifts and talents, different ones, different experiences that we bring together that are needed, as are those gifts and talents and experiences of those who are not within these walls this morning. And as much as we might not want to sometimes, we are called to scooch over to make room for others at the table. Others who we might not think we have anything in common with. Others who we might question if they should be there. And it doesn't leave us less space. I think with God, the table just grows, and our place is solidified when we do so. You see, every Sunday morning, Jesus invites all of us to his table for a meal, for a breakfast party, where we are to remember how he gave himself for us, to show us how much he loves us. And he promises us that we are in his presence truly in that moment. Now, some of us might not be sure that we're worthy. We might wonder, if Jesus only knew what I'd been up to, would he really want me here? But the good news that we find in Luke is that Jesus doesn't invite those who are deserving to the party. Jesus invites us. We who can never repay him. We who fail over and over again. We who struggle with sometimes thinking we're too high, sometimes believing ourselves too low. We who are often misfits. We who the rest of the world might look at and say, how does God think that they're special? Mr. Rogers was definitely lying about them. The good news is that Jesus promises us that we are special. We are known inside and out. We are loved as we are. We are his. And at Jesus' welcome table, there is a place card with your name on it. And we are all welcome to Jesus' neighborhood. Amen.